Good evening and welcome to the second of the 2013 Darwin College Lectures. My welcome is not just to you all here in the Lady Mitchell Hall, but of course to the many, many thousands of people around the world who will watch the video lectures later on, because they are very freely available on the web. This year's theme for the multidisciplinary Darwin College Lectures is foresight, and last week Sir Geoffrey Lloyd launched the series by speaking on foresight in ancient civilizations. This week, we consider foresight from the perspective of journalism. And it's my great pleasure this evening to introduce and welcome our speaker, Bridget Kendall. Bridget is the BBC's diplomatic correspondent. As you can imagine, she's been kept very busy in recent weeks with North African events, and she's indeed only recently returned from visiting Burma. Bridget Kendall is no stranger to Cambridge, having spent her childhood here. She attended the Perse Girls' School before reading modern languages at Oxford, LMH, where the M there is Margaret rather than our Mitchell. She went on to study further at Harvard and Moscow State University. Now, most of her career has been spent working for the BBC, including 4 years as the Moscow correspondent during the extraordinary events of the fall of the Soviet Empire, and then another 4 years as Washington correspondent. She's now the BBC's diplomatic correspondent, reporting, for example, on the fall of Gaddafi, and is host of the Forum on the World Service. Her awards include the James Cameron Award and Sony Radio Reporter of the Year Award, as well as an MBE. But she's particularly interested in Russia and its relationships with the West, and her interviewees include Vladimir Putin and Mikhail Gorbachev. Now, Napoleon Bonaparte is reputed to have said, "Forethought we may have, undoubtedly, but not foresight." Bridget Kendall has seen the fall of a great empire and the end of several powerful dictators. They clearly didn't have successful foresight. Maybe they should have listened to their media. I warmly welcome Bridget Kendall to speak on foresight in journalism.
Thank you very much, Professor Fowler, and for your kind words, and thank you everyone at Darwin for inviting me to take part in this wonderful event and for making me so welcome. I feel I should start with a disclaimer. There are, of course, all sorts of journalists. Some of them work for publicly funded organisations, some commercially funded. There are those who work for public broadcasters like me, whose editorial guidelines are based on impartiality. There are newspaper journalists whose organisations are, by and large, privately owned, and they used to be published once a day on paper, but now increasingly are joining us broadcasters in a 24/7 multimedia experience accessible at any time on many platforms. Then there are the citizen journalists and tweeters and bloggers, and some represent daunting competition or provide a valuable resource to professional journalists. Any of you who follow the Syria crisis closely may know the blog of Professor Joshua Landis of Oklahoma University, who collates articles and blogs and emails from a wide variety of global and Middle Eastern sources, plus his own commentary. And it's a must-read for those of us who are trying to keep track of events there. And then there are the tabloids. And even inside one organisation like the BBC, there are many different types of journalists. Those who work on daily output, those who do long-form investigative work, and those who report on events at home and foreign correspondence. So let me say at the outset that my lecture today is from my own experience of being a journalist, and I'm not trying to speak for the whole industry or for all journalists. What follows is my personal view. So, foresight in journalism. We all watch or listen to the news and read the papers, not only to find out what has taken place, but to get a steer on what might be coming up. Journalists like to think that they deal with hindsight, or possibly insight, but if they can also show foresight, undoubtedly they serve their audience better. But there's an irony here, because although journalists are frequently asked for their views on what might happen next, I doubt that many relish the prospect. As cub reporters, we were trained to observe and probe, and then relay back a faithful account of what we'd seen and heard. But on no account were we to stray into fabrication or speculation. Even specialist journalists who focus on a particular patch are generally wary of acting as seers. They prefer to back up their analysis with known facts, attributed quotations, and the solid rock of proven experience. It's the past, not the future, which is the foundation stone of their credibility. Being asked to peer into a crystal ball is a risky business. The result, you may have noticed, is that, at the BBC at least, we tend to hedge our bets by sticking to the facts, by offering a choice of scenarios, inserting caveats, or by using a formulation that's sufficiently open that there's little danger of being shown up as wrong. However, every year in December, a handful of BBC correspondents are put on the spot and asked to come up with some specific predictions for the Radio 4 Correspondents' Look Ahead programme. It's an annual ritual of potential humiliation, which is both nerve-wracking and exhilarating. So, how do BBC correspondents fare when it comes to soothsaying? Well, it's too early to test this year's predictions, but this is from last year's Look Ahead on December the 31st, 2011. Being called to account for what they predicted the year before are Newsnight economics editor Paul Mason, chief international correspondent Lise Doucette, and diplomatic correspondent James Robbins. The presenter is Owen Bennett-Jones.
Paul Mason from Newsnight. Europe crisis, you got it bang on. We saw everything that was coming, but I do have a quibble, which is you said Spain and Portugal before Italy.
Yes, I was totally under-predicting the scale of crisis. Who knew that the Euro-political elite could be as obstinate in pursuit of the strategy that has led to the various summit disasters? So I think I totally under-predicted the scale of crisis, and I'm determined not to do it this year.
Lise Doucette, now then, you're just back from Pakistan as I am, and you said last year Pakistan AFPAC, will lurch from crisis to crisis, which is completely right. North Waziristan will become another front, which it never did.
Well, it still is a front, as you know very well, Owen. It still is, to call it niche interests, but everyone knows just what's cooking in there, and some call it jihadist central, with every terrorist group or militant group known to man or not known to man has representatives or bases there.
But they'll remain there all this year, as they did last year, I think.
I think so, too.
James Robbins, you are the clear winner on this. I've been looking back, and 2008 you saw food riots coming, and 2009, when everyone was talking up Obama, you were saying, no, he'll run into the economic the turn down and so on. Last year, however, I do have to raise, Silvio Berlusconi will sail serenely on.
You see, I thought that he would only be brought down by his recreational activities, and in the end it was the economy that brought him down.
Well, a triumphant but also rueful James Robbins. And before that, you heard Lise Doucette and Paul Mason being quizzed by Owen Bennett-Jones, none of them sounding very comfortable. So why do journalists squirm and wriggle when asked to guess the future? It's very simple. Reputation. Trust and credibility are highly prized not just by individual journalists, but by a news organisation as a whole. If your audience doesn't trust you, they'll not bother to read or listen to what you have to say. And one of the easiest ways to damage your reputation for reliability is to make a rash prediction that turns out to be wrong. Indeed, those who make a habit of offering bold predictions run the risk of being lampooned. I expect quite a few of you remember the late and illustrious newspaper editor and columnist, Lord Rees-Mogg. He was a highly influential and well-informed journalist, but he was also not shy about making predictions. Indeed, he was so categorical about some of them, and fairly often so spectacularly wrong, that the satirical magazine Private Eye dubbed him Mystic Mogg. And when he died in December, Private Eye ran this full-page spread as a tribute, outlining some of his predictions. These included that in 1991 the Western world would enter a decade of escalating economic and political disorder unparalleled since the 1930s. 1991? Wrong decade. But otherwise, quite forward-thinking. Then, in 1996, he said Colin Powell would be elected America's first black president by a large majority. Wrong candidate, but again, over a decade too early, and he was onto something. Then, in 1997, he said it would be strange if Labour won by a landslide, and that in 2011, the euro crisis was already over. But accuracy of predictions isn't everything. William Rees-Mogg was entertaining, and he knew it. He apparently once said, "It's my job to be interesting, not right." He has a point. There is almost nothing worse than a boring piece of journalism. However accurate it is, it'll find few readers. And of course, you can also tarnish your reputation by being too cautious, or by failing to anticipate momentous developments which land right in front of you. This is where journalists often fall short of foresight. How many journalists did predict that in the United States there would be a first black president elected in 2008? And going further back, how many of us stationed in Moscow at the time thought that the Soviet Union would collapse quite so suddenly at the end of 1991? And more recently, how many Western journalists who are not based in Cairo or Tunis saw the Arab Spring coming? And how many of us recognized that the waves of protests which toppled presidents in Tunisia and Egypt at the start of 2011 would lead to revolutions in Libya and Syria? I know I didn't. I remember a broadcast from February 2011 where I argued that protests similar to those that ousted presidents in Tunisia and Egypt were surely unlikely to shake the governments of Libya and Syria, because Colonel Gaddafi and President Assad would learn lessons from what had happened and keep an iron grip on their people. Less than 2 weeks later, I found myself reporting on the Benghazi uprising in eastern Libya, which was to mark the start of the end of Colonel Gaddafi's rule. Never was a wrong prediction trounced so quickly. Being a journalist means to walk a tightrope. It's a perpetual balancing act between risk and caution, trying to be sufficiently agile to seek out and push the stories that matter, yet not going out on a limb only to be proved wrong. It's the tension between seeking safety in numbers, going with the herd, that lemming instinct you often see in journalists when they hunt as a pack and all leap over the cliff at once, and striking out on your own as a maverick, a lone wolf. It's also the tension between being first on the one hand and being right on the other. And getting that mix right can be difficult. Some news organisations place a greater premium on being first, getting the scoop to splash on their front page, or beating the other broadcasters with breaking news that cuts into scheduled programming. Others, and the BBC is one of them, believe their reputation rests more on being accurate, checking out new information from multiple sources before airing it, even if this means they sometimes lag behind the competition. After all, one off-the-cuff remark can come back to haunt you and colour your reputation for years to come. And these days, when everything's always archived somewhere online, it's a mistake which is there in public forever. Perhaps the most famous wrong prediction to be aired on the BBC was not strictly from a journalist, but from someone whose face was very familiar to TV news audiences. I'm talking about that veteran weather forecaster, Michael Fish, and his famous broadcast where in one throwaway line in a lunchtime forecast, he reassured those who might be anxious that a big storm was coming and declared there was nothing to worry about. If you weren't watching the lunchtime news on that particular day, October the 15th, 1987, or don't remember it, from the archives, very briefly, here is what he actually said.
Earlier on today, apparently a woman rang the BBC and said she heard that there was a hurricane on the way. Well, if you're watching, don't worry, there isn't. But having said that, actually, the weather will become very windy.
Is there a hurricane on the way? Don't worry, there isn't. Fateful words. In fact, a few hours later, the worst storm to hit southeast England for several centuries was to cause record damage and kill 18 people. Michael Fish was never allowed to forget it, although his mistake did make him famous, even winning him a slot in the video montage during the opening ceremony for the London 2012 Olympics. It's a lesson that if your prediction is outright wrong, it can be almost impossible to live it down. You might well need to embrace it as part of your legacy. So, what are the tools of the trade that may help journalists do better at prediction and foresight? One new tool is the power of social networks to connect to a wider group of actors and opinions. Perhaps one reason for my lack of foresight about the uprisings in Libya and Syria in early 2011 was because I, like many journalists, was still getting to grips with the revolution in communications which arose out of social networks. In the last few years, Facebook, Skype and Twitter have opened up new possibilities for all sorts of groups to leap over old boundaries and reach each other in virtual space while remaining invisible below the radar of official scrutiny. Professional journalists, who are at the heart of the old world of communications, the world of newsroom hubs, expensive satellite link-ups, and news delivered to desktops via wire services, perhaps were not so aware of what was happening. Perhaps that's why some of us failed to notice that new, less centralized ways of communicating and sharing information were emerging. My colleague Lise Doucette says she first became aware of the potentially transforming effect of social networks for journalism in 2009 during the so-called Green Revolution in Iran. When word came of the first street protests, older journalists in the BBC Tehran bureau rushed to their desktop computers to log on and try and work out what was happening by looking at news sites. At the other end of the office, younger journalists were on their phones, checking texts and blogs and the latest new thing, Twitter feeds. Their sources were faster and more detailed, if of course unverified, but it was the latest news straight from the street. By the time Lise came to cover the Arab Spring revolutions in 2011, Twitter had become her touchstone, a means of keeping abreast of fast-moving events, of being tipped off about possible new developments, and a way of being both challenged and supported by the audience.
January 25th in Cairo. We were on the top floor of the BBC Arabic Services Broadcast Centre in Aguza. Even on the 19th floor, you could taste and smell the tear gas. It was unfolding on the streets below. We were live on television. I was interviewing an old friend and former colleague, Yousri Fouda, who possibly now is arguably Egypt's most prominent, most influential journalist. And Yousri says on BBC, he says, look at that, look at the tear gas below. And that is tear gas canisters made in America. When I checked the Twitter feed, someone sent me a tweet saying, Lise Doucette, you didn't even challenge Yousri Fouda when he said those canisters are made in America. And I thought, oh dear. But then within seconds, another tweet arrives. Someone took a photograph on the streets, and there it was, a close-up of the canister, and it said, made in America. I said, thank you, Twitter.
The inimitable Lise Doucette. Lise was an early convert. For me, the revelation came with the Libyan revolution. At the outset, Colonel Gaddafi attempted to impose a media blackout, but it didn't work. Information emerged anyway, through texts, tweets, YouTube footage, and Skype interviews, corralled by a global network of activists. And we saw the same pattern in Syria when early on in the uprising, President Assad's troops tried to isolate the city of Homs. Now, these social networks are used by journalists the world over. They tap into them, they use them to tap into new sources of information, to reach a wider spectrum of opinion, and interact with both the subjects of their reports and the audiences who consume them. It's a resource which needs to be used with caution. Social networks can mislead as well as enlighten. It represents an alarming new mountain of material that needs to be waded through, and it will never replace the time invested in actually going to a place to meet and listen to people face to face. But it is a new way to enhance a journalist's grasp of what is happening and what might be around the corner. Another new tool is data. As Michael Fish pointed out in a BBC interview last year, given the amount of computer data now available to meteorologists, weather forecasts have become much more detailed and more reliable. These days, it would be highly unusual not to see a hurricane coming. In 1987, he says, it was the limitations of technology, not his forecasting skills, which was the problem.
The computer, of course, is the thing that did the forecast. But you can't blame that either, because it was unfortunate that the computer lacked a huge amount of data from the area that the storm was developing. But of course we didn't have the mega computers that we've got now, and the forecasts have got so much more accurate. The public won't believe that. I'm sure they'll all be laughing and chortling, saying, what a load of rubbish. But they have. Well, you must admit that the forecasts have got more and more accurate, and you can actually say that a 3-day forecast now is probably as good as a 24-hour, 36-hour forecast used to be a few years ago.
Well, we'll see. I gather the latest BBC forecast for tonight is 5 to 10 centimetres of snow. We'll find out tomorrow morning if that was more accurate than 25 years ago. Improved data has not only helped meteorologists. The volume of easily accessible public data and the new software tools which can interrogate it have created a new field known as data journalism. The primary aim is to extract patterns and then turn the sometimes surprising insights hidden in large data sets into journalistic stories, written up in text or explained through graphic visualizations. And it's an especially useful tool when making projections. Last year, one American practitioner hit the headlines through his spot-on analysis of the likely outcome, state by state, of the last US presidential election. Nate Silver is a New York Times blogger who combined polling data to come up with a remarkably accurate picture of how Barack Obama would sweep to victory for a second term. His prediction was controversial because it was at variance with the received wisdom of many pollsters. Their findings suggested that the race between President Obama and Governor Romney was too close to call. Many polls in swing states showed that the two candidates were neck and neck, hovering within just a few percentage points of each other. But for weeks before the election, and before that October surprise, Hurricane Sandy, which gave the president a last-minute boost, Nate Silver was insisting that the race was not narrow at all, and Barack Obama would win comfortably. When he was proved right, the election result briefly gave Nate Silver superpower status. Andrea Canning of NBC's Today programme went to meet him.
President Obama may have been the big winner this week, but coming in a close second, New York Times blogger, statistician, and self-described geek, Nate Silver.
I am Nate Silver, Lord and God of the algorithm.
For the second straight presidential election, Silver's 538 blog was pretty close to perfect in predicting the result. He nailed the outcome in all 50 states.
When you were a kid, did you have all the answers? Have you always been like this?
I think I always had a lot of questions, right? I think that's what smart people do.
Looking for a better way to pick the winning candidates, Silver created his own formula for playing the odds in political races, one that he's detailed in his new book, The Signal and the Noise.
People tend to see all this data, all these polls, and see the fluctuations in the polls and get very distracted by it. What we would call, in the book, I'd call it noise as opposed to signal.
Romney Ryan will win with 281 electoral votes. Bye-bye.
Avoiding the spin of talking heads, Silver sticks to the numbers, averaging statewide polls, factoring in for uncertainty, and then running a variety of scenarios for how these probabilities would play out.
When we say that Obama had like a 91% chance of winning the Electoral College, that meant that when we looked at all those combinations of different states, he won about 90% of those, and Romney won the other 10%.
American Breakfast News for you, a rather different pace from BBC reports on Nate Silver, the new Lord and God of the algorithm. However, data and numbers are not everything. Old-fashioned journalism means sifting through all sorts of information, not all of it quantifiable. And a third resource that journalists often take for granted is their privileged access to events and people at all levels, both at the very top of society and at the very bottom. In our era of citizen journalists and bloggers, it's this access which perhaps most distinguishes professional journalists from other analysts and observers. And even if sometimes the information that governments and other official sources are prepared to impart is so guarded and bland, it hardly seems worth having, it is valuable. You have to be careful not to be too swayed by whom you talk to and weigh up what they tell you against other evidence. But this is a chance to gain a unique insight into the thinking of leaders whose decisions may be important, a point of comparison which helps illuminate the way forward. On the one hand, you have whatever insights can be gleaned from briefings with officials on government policy, face-to-face public interviews with politicians, and private conversations with inside contacts, all of which may help confirm hunches or modify your assumptions, or possibly it may cause you to sigh in frustration at what looks like unrealistic ambitions or downright hypocrisy in a government policy. On the other hand, you can compare these inside sources with what's happening on the ground. Test political rhetoric against raw reality. In my experience, when diplomats and politicians and military generals brief journalists, they mostly want to tell you what they're hoping for. They rarely want to contemplate the possibility of failure. But get on a plane and go to a front line or a failing state or a country in the midst of a revolution, and you can match those political aspirations against what is really happening. Your own experience and conversations on the ground may give you a very different picture. Sometimes it'll allow you to foresee how it will all go wrong. Sometimes it may reveal that a government policy conceived in a capital many miles away is making a positive difference. But sometimes you might find counterintuitively that a conflict is not as serious as it's being made out to be. In the early 1990s, when I was stationed in Moscow for the BBC, I took a trip to Moldova, or Moldavia, as it still was then, a tiny Soviet republic on the border with Romania, where simmering tensions between Romanian speakers and Russian speakers had erupted into what was being described in Soviet newspapers as a mini-civil war. The Romanian speakers, along with many other ethnic minorities in the republics which made up the Soviet Union, wanted independence from Moscow. But the heavily industrialized and militarized Russian-speaking region of Transnistria inside Moldova was having none of it. The Russians there wanted to remain part of the Soviet Union. And there had been alarming reports of sporadic clashes which, it was said, had the potential to turn into a full-blown, bloody civil war. It wasn't easy to get to Transnistria. A flight to the Black Sea port city of Odessa and a long and jolting taxi ride. And when I finally arrived, I found a sleepy backwater where nothing much seemed to be happening. At a school turned into a temporary military headquarters, I asked officials on the Russian-speaking side to take me to the front line. No one seemed to think there was any danger. They gave me a rather unconvincing strip of white cloth to tie to my upper sleeve to show I was a member of the media and not a combatant, and pointed me in the right direction. I passed one bored Russian soldier smoking a cigarette, manning a checkpoint surrounded by sandbags. I passed two more empty checkpoints and several abandoned military vehicles. The road twisted and turned a little, going past fields and hedges. And then I came across a new group of soldiers eating sandwiches. This time, they were Romanian speaking. They looked at me in some surprise, but no alarm, and it turned out I'd walked across the so-called front line, but hadn't noticed it. It's true that this so-called frozen conflict was to remain a burden on Moldova for years to come, but it was not the alarming war I had read about in the Moscow newspapers. I concluded that President Gorbachev's beleaguered Soviet government wanted to play up the dangers of civil strife in Soviet republics out of desperation in order to make the case for keeping a strong central power. Usually, politicians want to play down calamities, not play them up. But this was an unusual case of reality being less dangerous than the official rhetoric suggested, and only by being able to go to Moldova to see the standoff for myself was I able to gain that understanding. Sometimes access to the top can give you useful insight into the character and likely behavior of world leaders. In 2001, I was invited to Moscow to interview the then still new Russian president, Vladimir Putin. I was to put questions to him from the BBC's global online audience, alongside two Russian journalists who fielded questions from Russian viewers. At the time, Mr. Putin, less than a year in office, had not given many interviews to foreigners. I think the Kremlin thought it would make him look flexible and modern to be seen communicating with people via the internet. It was a surreal experience. They had built a special TV studio inside the Kremlin, complete with flashing neon lights and an electronic backdrop to show off the email questions for the president flooding in from across Russia. But it was also an extraordinary chance to gauge what Mr. Putin was like close up. Perhaps my strongest impression was that there was not one, but two Mr. Putins. The first was quite hesitant, even shy, not quite sure how to answer when, for example, he was asked personal questions. The other Mr. Putin was quite a different character. He was fierce, easily angered, and especially touchy on human rights issues. He emerged when asked challenging questions about security and terrorism. I put one question to him on behalf of a Danish listener. She wanted to know if he thought Chechens would ever again consider Russia an ally given all the destruction and cruel methods, as she put it, used in the recent Russian military attack on them? Here is his answer in Russian, and I haven't added in the dubbed translation because what's most interesting is not what he says, but how he says it, his aggressive body language. Watch his face.
Хочу поблагодарить наших корреспондентов за эти вопросы, потому что в них, как принято говорить, как в капле воды отражается непонимание значительным числом аудитории на Западе того, что происходит у нас на Кавказе и в Чечне в частности. Российская армия и российский народ в целом никогда не вели никакой кампании против чеченского народа. Российская армия, особенно это касается последних событий, была вынуждена отвечать на тот вызов, который сделали экстремисты и международные террористы, напав на Дагестан.
Но тем не менее, те люди, которые там сейчас живут, чеченский народ, у многих, вот я сама была на границе Чечни, я сама беседовала со многими людьми, они имеют сейчас очень негативные отношения к России и к российскому правительству.
Многие имеют негативное, а многие позитивное. И могу вам сказать почему. Потому что сам чеченский народ от их правителей, которые объявили себя таковыми, ничего не получили, кроме грабежа и разбоя.
Well, I think his icy irritation comes across. He, of course, denied any problem and even thanked the Danish listeners the opportunity to correct the mistaken views of so many Westerners about the Caucasus. His reply was that the army never waged a campaign against the people of Chechnya. It was responding to terrorism. He didn't like it one bit when I challenged him, saying I'd just come back from visiting Chechen refugee camps and found the general attitude towards Russians very negative. I must add, it was a bit scary challenging him in Russian, getting the stress right and making sure I didn't make any grammatical mistakes. He is very intimidating. Nowadays, political analysts of Russia often refer to the Putin presidency as a 2 or now even a 3-stage process. Putin won in his first term, was prepared to reach out to the West, repair relations with NATO, which were damaged during the 1999 Kosovo bombing campaign, invite Western investors in and offer close collaboration on fighting international terrorism. Putin, too, took over in 2003 or 2004, according to analysts, around the start of his second term. He sacked his reformist prime minister. He oversaw a legal campaign against the oil tycoon Mikhail Khodorkovsky, which removed him as a potential rival by sending him to a Siberian prison camp. And influenced probably by Ukraine's Orange Revolution, he began to voice his fears that foreign agents from the Islamic world and from the West were seeking to manipulate or destroy Russian power from within by funding charities and other non-governmental organizations. So, did I see this change from Putin 1 to Putin 2 coming in 2001? Did that interview give me foresight into what sort of Russian president Vladimir Putin would become? Well, yes and no. In private, when asked what I made of Mr. Putin after that interview, I would frequently say that I thought his ability to switch between two personae was unsettling. The more private Mr. Putin seemed flexible, even a bit insecure, and open to contact with foreigners. But especially when it came to matters of state and security, his thin-skinned refusal to accept criticism was worrying. It veered on what looked like paranoia. And Mr. Putin, with the piercing blue eyes and turned-down lip, was not someone you would want to antagonize. But only in hindsight did I realize that my impressions were a useful hint of what was to become his increasingly authoritarian manner and style of leadership. In 2001, I would not have felt confident to make that prediction in public as a journalist. Is it true that the more you know about something, the easier it is to have foresight of what will happen? Or is there a danger of not being able to see the wood for the trees, or of being paralyzed by seeing multiple options, cursed by indecision in the face of too much information? If foresight is about wisdom, the ability to identify an underlying trend or shift and recognize its importance, then it would seem logical that the more context and understanding, the better. In a straw poll of some of my BBC colleagues, I found most agreed that even though a fresh pair of eyes on a situation can also be useful, generally, the more you know about something, the better your judgment is likely to be. As one veteran BBC journalist once said to me, The knowledge you reveal on air should be the tip of the iceberg. In other words, all judgments should be based on a mountain of hidden information and experience, which you do not necessarily display, but which informs the selection of every adjective, quotation, or shift of emphasis. But there are pitfalls that come with this. Journalists who are especially good at their job, able to sift through data and use their access, experience, and intuition to piece together a puzzle, may produce the scoop of the decade, but they're not always congratulated on their foresight. Sometimes they may find themselves accused of being too close to their sources and benefiting from special favours. On my old patch, the former Soviet Union, this was a particular hazard. When a foreign correspondent had good connections and a good understanding of what was going on, it was all too common to hear suspicions aired about possible links to the security services. One American journalist of Yugoslav extraction who fell victim to this was a man called Daško Doda. He was Moscow bureau chief for the Washington Post in the early 1980s, spoke good Russian, had good contacts, and enjoyed a reputation for groundbreaking reports on Soviet politics. As he subsequently described in his book Shadows and Whispers in 1984, he had a world exclusive. Ahead of anyone else, he reported the death of the Soviet leader Yuri Andropov. Not because anyone in the KGB or Communist Party had tipped him off, but because he was an expert criminologist who picked up the clues that the ailing Soviet leader must be dead from nuances and details. He noted a speech on television that omitted the mandatory homage to the General Secretary. He realized a scheduled jazz concert on the radio had been replaced by somber music. He noticed a press report that Andropov's son had returned early from abroad. And finally, on a late-night walk through the city centre, he noted the telltale lights on in the KGB headquarters and the Ministry of Defence, usually a sign that something momentous had happened. All those hints matched what he'd observed when the previous Soviet leader, Leonid Brezhnev, died 15 months earlier. Not surprising, none of his official contacts would confirm his hunch. Getting information out of Soviet officials was always difficult, and this was the most sensitive subject of all, the death of a Soviet leader. But the hints and hunches he had amassed were enough to convince him he must be right and led him to file his story. Unfortunately for him, in Washington that night, his editor attended a gala dinner at the US State Department and took the opportunity to run the story past both the Undersecretary of State, Lawrence Eagleburger, and the Soviet ambassador, Anatoly Dobrinin. Both of them dismissed the scoop and suggested Doda's imagination must have got the better of him. So, instead of being a Washington Post front-page exclusive, his report was toned down and published on page 28. The next morning, when he woke up in Moscow, expecting to find his byline on the front page, he was in for a massive disappointment. And to make matters worse, later that day, his foresight was proved right. The Kremlin confirmed that Yuri Andropov had indeed died, and there would now be a new Soviet leader. Daško Doda's cautionary tale doesn't end there, however. 8 years later, an article in Time magazine raised the possibility that he might have been co-opted by the KGB while in Moscow and accepted KGB money. Daško Doda was outraged. He took Time magazine to court for libel to clear his name, arguing that his exclusives from Moscow had not been the result of special favours, but good reporting. The case was settled out of court, but Time paid his legal fees and apologised. Daško Doda said subsequently that he felt he'd been completely vindicated. But it's a reminder that you can find a shadow cast over your reputation, not only for getting something wrong, but for getting something too right. In other words, you can pay the price for passing the test of foresight. Nowadays, it's financial journalists who find themselves the subject of scrutiny. The BBC's business editor, Robert Peston, has won a string of awards for his exclusive reports, including, most notably, his scoop in September 2007 that the bank Northern Rock was seeking emergency financial help from the Bank of England. I'm sure many of you remember it. As we know, before long there was a run on the bank, and it looked as though Northern Rock might collapse. The role of the media in a financial crisis became a hot topic in the press and in Parliament. The question being mulled over was this: If a journalist breaks a story about, say, a bank which suggests it's in serious trouble, are they making it more likely that the bank will go under? And should this journalist be applauded for showing extraordinary foresight as the result of diligent work? Or was it more likely that wittingly or unwittingly they were acting on information which served someone else's interests? At the House of Commons, the Treasury Select Committee invited Robert Peston and other financial journalists to answer questions about their journalistic practices. And this is how Robert Peston defended himself when he was asked by MP Michael Fallon if one of the reasons for his success was particularly close contacts and access to the Treasury.
Mr. Fallon, you will not be surprised that the one area where I am uncomfortable sort of talking in public is over sourcing of any sort. And over the years I've benefited from private conversations with members of this committee, and I think it'd be very unlikely that any of those members would wish me to divulge, those sorts of chats. So, if you'll forgive me, I mean, the one thing I would say is I've been a journalist for 25 years. I've done political journalism, I've done business journalism. I like to think I have decent contacts in the city. I like to think I have decent contacts in government, in Whitehall, the regulators. When I do a story, it is normally a process of putting together a jigsaw puzzle. It's not very, very, very rarely in my life has somebody rung up and said, "I've got a corker for you, here you go," and handed me something on a plate. It almost never happens. I know a bit about banking. I've been a banking editor in the past, actually, on Lionel's paper, the FT. In the summer of 2007, when markets closed down, I concluded this was likely to be the biggest story of my career, and I immersed myself in it, and more or less everything I've done since then has been a process of talking to probably hundreds of people over that period, working out the trends, working out what the stories were.
Robert Peston. It's not just financial journalists who may have to think carefully about the cause and effect impact of a report that could be construed as a forecast. In war, or indeed during any emergency, you also have to be aware that your report, which nowadays will reach a global audience in minutes, could affect the outcome. Where once British journalists were observers whose reports might take hours or even days to get back to London, and whose work was largely seen and heard by an audience sitting in their living rooms many miles from the scene, now any reporting from a conflict zone reverberates back into the place it was coming from. It can become real-time intelligence, which may put those you're reporting on in danger. In a chaotic hostage siege, like the one at the gas plant in the Sahara last week, do you want to reveal on air the fact that some captives have escaped and may have gone into hiding somewhere close by? What if the kidnappers hear you and decide to seek them out? When a hotel is taken over by gunmen, like the one in Mumbai, do you really want to let the gunmen know that you've been in mobile phone contact with guests locked in their bedrooms? If you're crouched in a bombed-out house in a suburb of Homs, like the late Sunday Times correspondent Mary Colvin, should you steer clear of giving live interviews by satellite from your location? It's thought it may have been the Syrian army picking up her signal and launching an attack on the house where she was staying, which led to her death. And when it comes to covering natural or man-made disasters, journalists have to be equally careful. In 1984, the BBC correspondent Michael Burke and his camera crew went to Ethiopia to cover the worst famine there for a century. In his report, he described it as a biblical famine in the 20th century and the closest thing to hell on earth. I expect quite a few of you remember it. The reporting on that famine by Michael Burke and other colleagues shocked people in Britain and helped bring world attention to the disaster. It was an early example which showed just how powerful this sort of journalism could be. Since then, increasingly, aid agencies and other development organisations who want to prevent new disasters have become highly attuned to the way they can harness this sort of journalism to get their message across. Politicians take note of powerful reports on the main broadcasting outlets and on the front pages of major newspapers. One effective way to get governments to act is to wage a campaign through the media to force public attention onto an issue and put it at the top of a government's agenda. So how far should a journalist go in forecasting a disaster? Most correspondents would say they apply the same criteria to this sort of story as they would to any other piece of journalism, reporting what they see, what they hear, and what they find to be credible, and what they found out for themselves at first hand by visiting the area in question. Indeed, those who cover these sorts of disasters often are probably especially careful not to be seen as advocates for campaigning organisations. But on occasion, correspondents who have flagged up possible famines in various parts of Africa have been accused of exaggeration. There have even been allegations they played up emergencies precisely to make a splash on a front page or a prominent TV report. And if you warn of an emergency which doesn't materialise, the impact, of course, can be counterproductive. Not only does it undermine your own reputation, crying wolf may mean the next time a real plea for help gets less attention. But surely there's also an argument to be made for going to the scene of a potential disaster precisely to tell the world that an emergency is imminent but could be averted if swift action is taken. In 2011, aid agencies feared a new food emergency in the Horn of Africa. This was not yet a famine, but they were worried that without speedy assistance from abroad, it soon could be. The BBC decided this was news worth covering, even though it was not reporting on the fact of a famine, but looking ahead, highlighting the possibility. Reporters and TV presenters were sent to the region to gather material which was played out across TV and radio, including this report by Ben Brown from northern Kenya. The aim was to draw awareness to a prediction in the hope that it would not then come true.
It's their first sight of real food for weeks. These refugees have just arrived from Somalia, and once they get a yellow wristband, they're entitled to immediate rations of flour, beans and cooking oil, enough to last them for a fortnight. They are, though, the fortunate few. Beyond this camp, whole swathes of eastern Africa are now ravaged by drought and malnutrition. So the people here are getting some help at last, but the United Nations World Food Programme say they expect that 10 million others in this corner of Africa are going to need their help in the next few months. Those who haven't yet got their rations look on enviously. There are more people arriving here every day to escape Somalia's drought and civil war.
It's an interesting new development in the complex relationship between journalists, aid agencies and government, a much more sophisticated collaboration. In this instance, all sides laid bare, if you like, the propaganda purpose of the reporting and relied on the public to appreciate that this did not detract from its value. The opposite of foresight is hindsight. And I suppose the modest ambition of any journalist is to be able to look back at their work and conclude there's nothing they have reported which they would now like to retract or amend. Sadly, that's not always how it is. In the huge volume of reports journalists churn out, there's always cause for regret. And perhaps the most infamous example is how the mainstream Western media reported on the run-up to the 2003 American-led invasion of Iraq. There's been plenty of criticism for the way some Western journalists went with the flow of government thinking when it came to the crucial question in 2002 and 2003 of whether Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq, might be hiding weapons of mass destruction. Some media outlets and journalists have since admitted that they were too credulous of British and American government claims that those weapons of mass destruction existed and posed an international threat. I think I and many of my colleagues retained a healthy scepticism about what we were being told. But the ambush we fell into, I believe, was that we placed too much weight on past evidence and on logical explanations. It is well known that Saddam Hussein had developed a chemical weapons program. He'd used chemical weapons in the 1980s against Iranian soldiers in the Iran-Iraq war and against his own people, most notably in a notorious attack on Iraqi Kurds in 1988. And after the 1991 war in the Gulf, United Nations weapons inspectors had found substantial stockpiles of chemical munitions in Iraq and destroyed them. And in the wake of that first Gulf War, it also emerged that he had created a large and clandestine biological weapons program. Though by 2003 he was claiming it had been destroyed, it was hard to be sure he was telling the truth. The logical assumption, given his past behaviour, was that a leader such as Saddam Hussein might well be hiding illicit weapons so that he could turn to them, as he had done before, as a weapon of last resort. That was why it seemed reasonable in 2002 to send in more UN weapons inspectors to track down any remaining stockpiles, and his failure to collaborate fully with them only intensified suspicions that he had something to hide. All these are rational assumptions. But in 2005, 2 years after the American-led invasion, we were to find out that logic and the lessons of history do not always lead you to the right conclusion. After exhaustive searches in the now-occupied Iraq, the Iraq Survey Group of international weapons inspectors finally concluded that it was unlikely Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. Their belief was that he probably had destroyed his biological stocks in the mid-1990s, as he claimed, and although he may have wanted to keep the capability to restore his chemical arsenal in due time, in 2003 there was no immediate threat. So then, why didn't he help himself in being completely open with UN inspectors and allow them to clear him of suspicion? The answer, the Iraq Survey Group argued, was that Saddam Hussein hoped to have it both ways. He may have wanted to avoid an American invasion, but he also wanted to keep his image of the strong man of the Middle East, possibly to impress his underlings, or maybe to keep potentially dangerous rivals in the region at bay. In other words, above all, Saddam Hussein desired to be respected and feared. So even though it was not in his interests, he couldn't bring himself to deny outright the possibility that he could still wield weapons which gave him an aura of absolute power. In some contorted way, this crazy mindset made sense. But how could we have foreseen it? It's an interesting lesson, because sometimes an outcome cannot be explained by logic or tracked on the basis of experience or arrived at by looking at historical precedent. Human beings are not rational animals. Their behavior and their choices can be quirky. Nate Silver's algorithms are all very well, but sometimes relying on data or past practice can be a trap. For example, in the United States, it used to be gospel among election reporters that whoever made it to the presidency would first have to carry the New Hampshire primary for their party. Then, in 1992, Bill Clinton broke the mold. He failed to win New Hampshire and nearly ducked out of the race, but, ever the comeback kid who never gave up, he went on to win the election nonetheless. So that bit of election law had to be discarded. Then there was that other piece of conventional wisdom, that when it comes to electing presidents, the American people rarely vote for senators. They prefer those who already have wielded executive power as governors. It was true in the case of Jimmy Carter, of Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, and George W. Bush, all of them governors who went on to become president. Indeed, until 5 years ago, the last senator to move directly from the Senate to the White House was J.F. Kennedy, back in 1960. But in 2008, the American people elected not just a first-time senator with one of the most liberal voting records in the Senate, but a black man as well. So what use was the old adage about senators and presidents now? But actually, it shouldn't have been that surprising. The United States is an extraordinarily dynamic place, constantly reinventing itself. Its people are instinctively drawn to innovation, including new ways of behaving and voting. For all its conservatism with a small c, one of America's strengths is that it relishes breaking new ground and challenging stereotypes. And there's a broader point here. Truly impressive foresight is to be able to see ahead to those really big changes which will have far-reaching consequences, the paradigm shifts which change the world on its axis. Do journalists excel at this? Well, probably usually not, precisely because they're expected to back up assumptions with reasoned and fact-based arguments. Whereas to cast your mind towards a future that hasn't happened yet, you need something more, a leap of imagination, or an insight that comes from being able to step back from what you see and put it in a different framework. Doskadoda's description of how he got his scoop on Andropos' death illustrates the role of intuition and a seasoned observer's hunch. But sometimes it's the new observer who brings insights from another discipline who's best placed to see a crisis coming. Gillian Tett is a former US managing editor for the Financial Times, an award-winning columnist and one of the paper's stars. Before the financial crisis of 2008, probably not that many people had heard of her. But after the financial crash, she became a household name because she was one of the few city journalists who, as early as 2006, foresaw the possibility of a crisis in global credit markets and warned of the dangers of overpriced assets in her FT articles. By 2006, she'd returned to London from heading the paper's Tokyo bureau and was on the paper's city desk, writing about the rarefied and highly technical world of collateralized debt obligation and credit default swaps. She admits it was not at first a subject she was a specialist in. But Gillian was also a social anthropologist. Perhaps some of you here may know her. She did her PhD here at Clare College, Cambridge, looking at marriage rituals in Tajik villages. In fact, Dushanbe, the capital of Tajikistan, is where I first met her in 1992 when I was on a trip from Moscow. Anyway, she soon realized that anthropology was a brilliant background for studying how bankers behaved in the world of high finance. It was useful both because anthropologists look at cultures holistically, from the point of view of people and society, not financial figures, and because it was a discipline which allowed her to analyze bankers and what they did from an entirely fresh perspective. As she describes here in this keynote speech she gave at a conference for the Royal Anthropological Society, she soon identified a worrying and dangerous flaw in their financial model.
As I sat there and listened to their founding mythology about how credit derivatives was supposed to work, I could see, dimly at first and later much clearly, but I could see that there were some very big intellectual contradictions in terms of what they were saying. I won't go into that in detail, but just by way of example, one of the great founding myths about credit derivatives was that the bankers were creating the perfect free market in credit where anything could be traded and everything could be priced according to free market principles. That was a great theory. In practice, when you look back at what was going on in 2005 and 2006, many of the products they were creating were so unbelievably complicated that they were impossible to trade. And so actually, far from having a free market in these new credit products, you had an entirely fictional market where products were being priced on the basis of computer models, not free market prices, because these products were too complicated to trade. So there were no market prices. So absolutely fundamental intellectual contradiction, which almost nobody could see back then because everyone had, drunk the Kool-Aid. They believed their own ideology. Not because they were bad people, let me stress. It's very convenient to blame the bankers on being greedy or evil. I don't think they were. I think, they wanted to make money, but I think they actually believed their own founding mythology. And as anthropologists know, that is not unusual. Almost every society in the world has some kind of cognitive map in place and shared cultural rituals and symbolic landscape which reinforces the position of the elites. Once again, this is Anthropology 101. And that cognitive map is often riddled with contradictions, which go largely unrecognized, largely because, as Bourdieu says, there are big social silences. It's what people don't discuss that's important in finance, as in a Tajik village, as what they do discuss. So, in a funny kind of way, my Anthropology 101 was absolutely critical in helping me to try to understand not just what was happening inside finance in 2005 and 2006, but also, I would say, in spotting some of the dangers and above all else, spotting some of the limitations about the way that bankers and financiers were looking on the world. I often joke in retrospect that if only the banks had had a few anthropologists sitting there in their senior echelons, they might not have been quite so dumb.
I love that. When it comes to foresight, forget data journalists and financial analysts, social anthropologists rule. Gillian Tett of the Financial Times. So what is my conclusion? Sometimes a journalist may display extraordinary foresight in spotting a trend or shift when no one else does. It may be because they bring a fresh perspective, which, as Gillian Tett puts it, means they can see flaws in others' assumptions because they haven't drunk the Kool-Aid. It may be because of a hunch built on years of experience, a wide range of contacts, and a final flash of insight which allows the last piece of the jigsaw to slot in. It may be because they can venture where others cannot, taking the risk to slip into Aleppo, for instance, to see for themselves how the civil war in Syria is unfolding. New tools like data journalism or tapping into social networks may bring new insights, although rational analysis and information gleaned from afar may have limits when it comes to understanding the vagaries of human nature. But as a rule, I'd say don't expect journalists to foretell the future. Their ambition is much more modest. I hope that their reports and insights will stand the test of time and merit that description of their trade as the first rough draft of history. Thank you.
So like the Soviet Union, like Rome or Imperial Spain, many great empires fall suddenly. Blink and it's gone. Curiously, though, the British Empire started falling with the independence of Canada in 1867 and is still, like an aged oak, sprouting new branches. Why so slow to fall? Well, one of those green shoots are people like Bridget Kendall here, heard on that sort of remarkable relic of empire, the BBC World Service. I think of the Chinese proverb, if you're planning for a year, sow rice. If you are planning for a decade, plant trees. If you're planning for a lifetime, educate people. That's kind of timely for us here in a university particularly, and for the World Service. So, Bridget, thank you very much indeed for a fascinating lecture across a great sweep of time and cultures, an insight into people and places and events that we're very unlikely to go to or to meet or to experience at all. You've given us a huge amount to think about, and we're most grateful to you for coming here tonight. And to all the rest of you here, I hope the expected snow doesn't prove disruptive this evening. After all, it may not snow perhaps until 3 a.m, or it may not snow at all. And by tomorrow morning, we will all have ground truthed and judged the weather forecast. So, thank you, Bridget.